Now, maybe I'm going to overstate the importance of this memo and Google's reaction to it. Maybe it will all blow over in a couple of weeks like everything else seems to. But to me, the memo by the Google employee, and more importantly, the company's reaction to it by firing James Damore, feels like an important turning point. And yes, I understand this is just the latest iteration in the company's embrace of social justice narratives, but I believe this is somewhat different because instead of just virtue signaling their agreement with politically correct views, Google has made a public statement that feelings and ideology trump objective facts and evidence, and that there are certain topics that are absolutely not up for discussion in the echo chamber that is the Google culture. And further, by making this statement, they vindicate the claims made by the author of the memo. So first, let's have a brief look at the memo. Notice straight out of the gate, Gizmodo calls it an anti-diversity screed. So I was gearing up for a good rant. But in fact, if you take the time to read it, it's actually fairly pro-diversity. If anything, the memo doesn't go far enough, in my opinion, and makes too many concessions to the diversity crowd. Now, this article came out 2 days ago, but since then, we've learned that Gizmodo had conveniently edited it. So let's go to the source instead. It starts off, I value diversity and inclusion. I'm not denying that sexism exists and don't endorse using stereotypes. When addressing the gap in representation in the population, we need to look at population-level differences in distributions. If we can't have an honest discussion about this, then we can never truly solve the problem. Psychological safety is built on mutual respect and acceptance, but unfortunately our culture of shaming and misrepresentation is disrespectful and unaccepting of anyone outside its echo chamber. Well, you've certainly learnt that now, haven't you? But I have to say, I despair at a society where people talk seriously about psychological safety outside the realm of mental illness. We're talking about opinions here, viewpoint diversity, but of course that's the only type of diversity that's not allowed these days. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but note this guy goes out of his way to present a balanced picture. He presents biases on both sides of politics and notes, neither side is 100% correct and both viewpoints are necessary for a functioning society, or in this case, company. Google's left bias has created a politically correct monoculture that maintains its hold by shaming dissenters into silence. This silence removes any checks against encroaching extremist and authoritarian policies. He goes on to describe that Google's position is that it is unconscious bias that's holding women back. Stunning how such scientifically flimsy theories take hold. And he suggests there are other possible causes like sex differences. Note the great pains he goes to avoid sounding like a biological essentialist. I'm not saying that all men differ from all women in the following ways or that these differences are just. I'm simply stating that the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation of women in tech and leadership. And he provides these charts by way of explanation. And again, emphasises the point. Reducing people to their group identity and assuming the average is representative ignores this overlap. This is bad, and I don't endorse that. I mean, this guy is going out of his way to say, look, treat people as individuals, not as members of a group identity. He then moves on to the well-established concepts of the big 5 personality traits. And if you're familiar with this stuff, it shouldn't be surprising. Women are more open, higher in agreeableness and neuroticism. He cites the evidence which I've talked about here many times before. Contrary to what the social constructivists argue, the more egalitarian your society, the greater the differences. And thus he says, we need to stop assuming that gender gaps imply sexism. He then offers some non-discriminatory ways to increase the participation of women in tech. And this is what I meant earlier by going too far. If you can establish that women being underrepresented in a particular occupation is not due to sexism, then why do anything about it? And why then isn't there an equally urgent push to get more men into veterinary science or psychology? He then goes on to outline the way Google discriminates by having special classes for people of a certain gender or racial background, and lowering standards for diversity candidates. He then finishes with quite an extensive list of common sense suggestions. In totality, this guy is actually in favour of diversity, but not in favour of measures that discriminate based on weak concepts for which there's very little scientific basis, such as unconscious bias and equating unintentional microaggressions with violence. So obviously such a balanced and measured memo was met with an equally balanced and measured response. No, of course not. Check out this emotional weakling. This is the day-to-day business of a major tech company. By publishing that memo, dude wasn't just holding on to shitty ideas, he was committing violence. People felt afraid. People had to take days off. People feared for their safety. This is the point where I want to push the eject button on humanity. I want to fly off to that secret valley in Atlas Shrugged with all the other clinically sane people and watch the world implode under the weight of its own stupidity. If you took a day off because of that memo, because you were concerned for your safety, you should be immediately sacked for being an emotional infant. How could you possibly cope with reality if you were that psychologically damaged? And what would a drama like this be without a violent leftist chiming in? Firstly, I doubt you could beat the shit out of a chihuahua. And secondly, you're just confirming the author's points about there being no room for dissenting opinions. Now let's have a look at the responses from Google's officialdom. Here's Danielle Brown, Vice President of Diversity, Integrity and Governance, a bullshit title if there ever was one. Many of you have read an internal document shared by someone in our engineering organisation expressing views on the natural abilities and characteristics of different genders, as well as whether one can speak freely of these things at Google. And like many of you, I found that it advanced incorrect assumptions about gender. I'm not going to link to it here, as it's not a viewpoint that I or this company endorses, promotes, or encourages. So the memo advances incorrect assumptions, although you're not going to tell us what they are because you'd have to engage in open debate and provide evidence for your claims, and no one in an echo chamber wants to have to do that. Diversity and inclusion are a fundamental part of our values and the culture we continue to cultivate. We are unequivocal in our belief that diversity and inclusion are critical to our success as a company, and we'll continue to stand for that and be committed to it for the long haul. As Ari Baloff said in his internal G+ post, building an open, inclusive environment is core to who we are and the right thing to do. Nuff said. Translation. We're for diversity and inclusion because we are strongly committed to it, because we think it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether it's backed by a strong evidentiary basis, because diversity and inclusion is good, and if you don't think so, you're wrong, because reasons. Part of building an open, inclusive environment means fostering a culture in which those with alternative views, including different political views, feel safe sharing their opinions. But that discourse needs to work alongside the principles of equal employment found in our code of conduct, policies, and anti-discrimination laws. Anytime you see someone trying to justify their authoritarian behaviour with a but or a however, you can disregard what came before it. Clearly, the actions of Google demonstrate that you don't entertain alternative political views, and now others with similar views will feel even less safe to share them, and rightfully so. They know what the punishment for wrong speak is. Now let's have a look at what the Google CEO Sundar Pichai had to say. First, let me say we strongly support the right of Googlers to express themselves, and much of what was in that memo is fair to debate, regardless of whether a vast majority of Googlers disagree with it. However, you can now disregard what I just said because I'm going to give a bullshit justification. Portions of the memo violate our code of conduct and cross the line by advancing harmful gender stereotypes in our workplace. To suggest a group of colleagues have traits that make them less biologically suited to that work is offensive and not okay. And so this for me is what makes this different. It's not just your run-of-the-mill virtue signalling to a politically correct narrative. It is the public admission that feelings and taking offence take precedent over facts and evidence. Now, of course, you'd be right to point out that this has basically been YouTube's policy now for a year or so, that videos can be demonetized or removed if someone's feelings get hurt. So it shouldn't be surprising. But I still think the CEO's statement demonstrates that the entire culture at Google has been infected with this social justice virus and has created an echo chamber intolerant of real diversity of thought. It is contrary to our basic values and our code of conduct, which expects each Googler to do their utmost to create a workplace culture that is free of harassment, intimidation, bias, and unlawful discrimination. Yet you run classes that specifically discriminate against certain groups, white males, and that lower the standards for minority candidates. Do you even understand the basic notion of discrimination? Now remember, the case for gender diversity is that having more women at your workplace makes your workplace better. That, by definition, means that women bring some positive set of attributes that are missing. So by definition, women must be different then. Otherwise, why have more of them if they're just the same as men? And so the author of the memo points out the ways in which men and women are different, backed by well-established science, and Google says, you're fired. Ben Shapiro summed this up well in a tweet. Google, women improve workplaces because they are different from men. Memo guy, women are different, on average, from men. Google, fired. Exactly. But are the memo guy's claims really accurate? Well, take it from Jordan Peterson. Or better still, how about the 4 scientists that backed Memo Boy as factually accurate on just about all counts? Lee Jussum, Professor of Social Psychology at Rutgers. The author of the Google essay on issues related to diversity gets nearly all of the science and its implications exactly right. He then goes on to say, the arrogance of most of the comments reflects exactly the type of smug, self-appointed superiority that has led to widespread resentment of the left among reasonable people. To the extent that such views correspond to those at Google, they vindicate the essayist's claims about the authoritarian and repressive atmosphere there. Even the response by Google's new VP in charge of diversity simply ignores all of the author's arguments and vacuously affirms Google's commitment to diversity. Here's Jeffrey Miller, evolutionary psychology professor at University of New Mexico. For what it's worth, I think that almost all of the Google memo's empirical claims are scientifically accurate. Moreover, they are stated quite carefully and dispassionately. Its key claims about sex differences are especially well supported by large volumes of research across species, cultures, and history. And how about this traitor to women, Deborah So, a science writer with a PhD in sexual neuroscience? As a woman who's worked in academia and within STEM, I didn't find the memo offensive or sexist in the least. I found it to be a well-thought-out document asking for greater tolerance for differences in opinion and treating people as individuals instead of based on group membership. Within the field of neuroscience, sex differences between men and women when it comes to brain structure and function and associated differences in personality and occupational preferences are understood to be true because the evidence for them, thousands of studies, is strong. This is not information that's considered controversial or up for debate. If you tried to argue otherwise or for purely social influences, you'd be laughed at. But the exact opposite is true in that hermetically sealed echo chamber that is Google. The sneering, condescending attitude of the holier-than-thou feelings before facts crowd can't even fathom that their worldview may be misguided. We don't even need to explain why Memo Guy is wrong. They know they're right because their college professors and the media told them so, and anyone that disagrees with them is obviously a bigot. But the reality of Google's firing of James Damore proves one of the central theses to his memo, that Google has created a culture of groupthink, leftist bias, and dissenting opinions won't be tolerated. So do you think this is all a little overblown, or is this shitstorm just getting started? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.